All right. So I am Charlie Hurst. I'm the school board organizer with Michigan Education Justice Coalition. And before I introduce our presenter, Eric, please let me tell you a little bit about MEJC. Um, I'm sure most of you know that we're a statewide coalition that envisions a future where every student can access a quality public education. And we believe that school districts should represent a multiracial democracy where all voices are valued. We strive to eliminate the opportunity gap, meet the needs of every student, and ensure equitable access to resources and a fulfilling education. We envision public school board members to transform our educational systems, to develop change agents that empower their communities. Students should be prepared, inspired, and encouraged to be lifelong curious learners, creating and driving innovation. And school boards are a great place to make that a reality. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And while we're going along today, if any questions come up, please feel free to drop them in the chat. There will be time for Q&A throughout the presentation. And if you aren't sure what a word or term is, please let us know. You can put up your little jargon giraffe and we will make sure that we define the terminology. But first, I wanted to let y'all know about some events that MEJC has coming up. If you are on a school board, then you might be interested in this sign-on letter we have to the Michigan congressional delegation in support of the Department of Education. So I just dropped a link to that document in the chat. We are collecting signatures from school board reps through Friday. If you're not a school board rep, but you have a school board member, please feel free to share it with your favorite school board reps. And we also want to invite you to our upcoming event on Tuesday. It's fight night for MEJC, babies versus billionaires, and we're going to really be doing a deep dive in the current political landscape and how we need to fight for funding for our public education here in Michigan. And then finally, please, 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 please save the date for our lobby day. We're going to be going to Lansing and setting up appointments with our legislators to discuss our public education agenda. So that is going to be on April 29th. And now I'd like to turn it over to our facilitator, Eric John Roberts. He is a master municipal clerk and former school board member for Kanoa Hills Public Schools. He served from 2017 through 2022. He is a law student at the University of Toledo and an advocate for open government and democracy. And please note, Eric is not a lawyer. He is a law student, and this is not legal advice. For legal advice, please ask your counsel. All right, Eric, take it away.
Thanks, Charlie. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this evening. Like Charlie mentioned, a little bit about me. I served Kanoa Hills Public Schools as a school board member for 6 years. I was elected in 2016, and that was before I moved to attend law school. I now live in Ann Arbor Public School District and attend the University of Toledo for law school. A lot of my research has been around Michigan sunshine laws. I've given presentations like this to a few different public bodies. I worked for 2 different township governments and trained some of them in the Open Meetings Act when there were new folks elected. So thanks for all being here, and especially those of you that are brand new to school boards. This is a great endeavor to serve your community. And it's great to be already looking at how can I do this better? How can I make sure I've got the skills needed, the skills necessary to advocate for my students? Charlie, you want to advance this for me? Oops, one back. Okay, so this presentation is slated to go till 7:30. And in it, I want to leave you understanding the legal authority of public bodies and your own rights as individual members of school boards, as well as reviewing the most commonly used parts of Robert's Rules of Order. Understanding that the OMA does limit your actions in certain ways and empower you to make positive legislative change in your communities. Next slide. Okay, so this I took from MASB, the hierarchy of authority here, just so everyone is on the same page. You all are bound by the U.S. Constitution and then federal laws, the state constitution, state laws. There are some pieces of mandatory things the State Board of Education does, but largely their role is administering the Michigan Department of Education and hiring the state superintendent, similar to the role you play locally. And then way down here, your own policies and bylaws you can create, and in them you can adopt standing rules of order. The one that we're covering today is Robert's Rules of Order, but just to make it clear, the Open Meetings Act is here in Michigan laws, right? It's up here in Michigan laws, so that is mandatory for all school board members. Whereas Robert's Rules of Order, you might adopt, or you might adopt just parts of it. We recommend, adopting the parts that your board uses and putting them in one kind of document so that the public and your members can understand it, because Robert's Rules of Order is a 500-page stuffy textbook, and not all the things apply to 7-member school boards. Next slide. Okay, so if you're following along, here are 2 links. They're also later on in this, and we will send out the links to these public documents. Open Meetings Act Handbook is built by the Michigan Department of Attorney General, and I recommend printing this out and having it with you. It's a great way. It will answer the questions that will come up during your school board meetings, and it's okay to say if we don't know the particular statute right now, it's okay to take a couple minutes, find the answer in this OMA handbook, and then proceed, just to make sure that you're on the up and up with this required statute, the Open Meetings Act. And then there's the link to the statute here as well. Next slide. Okay, so here's the basics. First up, it's worth going over who has to follow the Open Meetings Act. The OMA applies to all meetings of a public body, which is broadly defined as a state or local legislative or governing body, including a board, commission, committee, subcommittee, authority, or council that exercises governmental or proprietary authority. And so it's important to understand who's not covered by the Open Meetings Act. If there are purely advisory groups, so you might have a subcommittee of 3 school board members that by themselves are not able to adopt any policy. You might have a policy committee that has 3 school board members. That is not subjected to the Open Meetings Act, so long as it's south of a quorum, which would be 4 out of 7 on a 7-member school board, and as long as they can't exercise governmental authority. If they're purely recommending things to the school board or to that public body, they are not subject to the Open Meetings Act. Any subcommittees that are empowered to exercise or perform a function must follow the Open Meetings Act. So that would be if you have a subcommittee that's going to narrow down applicants for a role in the district, that might be subject to the Open Meetings Act. It comes down to whether they're performing a function. Next slide. So in the case of Pinebrook Warren versus the City of Warren in 2022, the City Council in Warren created a medical marijuana licensing review committee. The committee made recommendations for approval or disapproval that the City Council then voted on. So what do folks think? Do they have to follow the Open Meetings Act? This one is a no, and the Court of Appeals decided that it's a no because that licensing review committee could not independently approve or disapprove licenses going to those facilities. That was ultimately left to the City Council. So if you, as a school board or a member of a public body, charge another group with making recommendations to you, they do not have to follow the Open Meetings Act, but the public body that makes those final decisions must follow the Open Meetings Act. Next slide. Okay, so here's a little quiz. And as folks are filling this out, the question is who must follow the Open Meetings Act? And we've got a few different types of things that you might run into as a school board member.
So is everyone filling out that poll that should have popped up on your screens?
Looks like it's halfway filled out. So we're getting there.
This is great to see all of the responses. We're going to give it just about one more minute to let everyone else get through the poll. It's kind of a long one. All right, get those last questions in, everybody.
Okay, looks like we've almost got everyone. So we'll start with the first one. This should be the easy one, hopefully. Do school boards have to follow the Open Meetings Act? Yes, when you're a quorum. So anytime that there's 4 out of 7 of you. Also on this call, I saw someone from Grand Rapids, so they have a 9-member school board. Any 5 out of 9 of you together must follow the Open Meetings Act. The second question, sex education advisory boards. In Michigan, a sex ed advisory board does not have to follow the Open Meetings Act by law. Now, you may, if you choose to, create a local policy that requires the sex ed advisory board to follow the Open Meetings Act. By law, if your school district teaches anything beyond abstinence and general HIV prevention, those are both mandatory topics. If you teach anything beyond that, then you must have a sex ed advisory board. And in the statute, they are not empowered to adopt the curriculum. They're going to recommend things to you, the school board, for final approval for a K-12 reproductive health curriculum. So they do not have to because they don't have the authority to approve that curriculum themselves. That's up to you, the school board members. Next, does the OMA need to be followed by a special joint meeting with your whole school board and entire city council? The answer is yes. Independently, either one of those groups would have to follow the OMA. So they do have to follow it together because there's a quorum of either one in one location. School board finance committees. This one is a yes only if a quorum is present. That was not one of the options, so don't worry about that one. But reminder, the thing that this turns on is whether or not there is a quorum of your school board. So if you have a finance committee that's made up of 3 members and they can't independently approve anything, they're just reviewing the district finances prior to a school board meeting, it would be at that school board meeting where you could adopt the district's finance report. So it's a no if you're south of the quorum. It's a yes if you're at or above the quorum. A district bond advisory committee. This one is a no. Again, these are just recommending things to the school board to consider putting in the ballot language when you're going to put a bond question before the voters. That must be done by a school board. So a district bond advisory committee does not have to follow the OMA unless for some reason you had 4 school board members on it. But that's really not necessary for bond advisory committees. It could be 1 or no members of a school board. They're simply making recommendations to you. And then this last one, most folks answered yes. The answer to this one is a no. Boards of public universities in Michigan, like the University of Michigan, MSU, Grand Valley, Ferris State, there's 13. For some reason, they have a carve out. I just put this one in there because this is a Michigan Supreme Court decision that said they don't have to follow the Open Meetings Act, largely because they're not built by a statute. They're built by the state constitution, whereas all school boards authority comes from state statutes. So the Supreme Court said no on that one, but with the rules we learned today, it maybe should be a yes. All right, next slide. So, public noticing. Your public body may not meet without first providing public notice to the community. This is a date, time, and location of meetings, and they must be in a public notice. Your schedule of regular meetings must be available within 10 days of the first meeting of the year. Most school boards choose either January to December or July to June. Either one of those, you have to post your regular meetings within 10 days of your first year that your board calendar uses. If you use a January board calendar, it's posted in January. And in July, if you use a July to June calendar, you must post it in July. And you have to put these up at the public body office. And if you have any online presence, it must be put on the online website as well. Next slide. Okay, so what about rescheduled meetings? The Open Meetings Act requires a meeting to be held in a place available to the general public. So reconvening meetings is very rare, though it must happen if the space where a public body is meeting is too small for the public that's present to be present in that meeting. You might move, occasionally this happens to boards. If you're meeting at the school board office, the Board of Administration building, you might have to move to a high school auditorium that same night if there are 100 people that want to attend your meeting. Doing this in advance of a meeting is advised if you know about it. If you think that there might be a reason for lots of people to come out, it's good to have your meetings posted or changed to be in a larger venue that can accommodate folks. Those changes are posted within 3 days of a meeting, including again that date, time, and place, and 18 hours prior to a meeting. No meetings occur without notice of more than 18 hours, including special meetings. So if you get to a meeting and are unsure whether the notice has been given at least 18 hours in advance, you do have a legal duty to ask, and you need to make sure that that notice was provided. If it wasn't, then you should probably move to adjourn the meeting. Ask your counsel if they're there, but if you don't have 18 hours in advance, then the issues you decide in that meeting may be subsequently nullified by a court if they find an Open Meetings Act violation. Next slide. Okay, so the things that are not in the Open Meetings Act, oddly enough, are agendas. Agendas are not required by the law, though we here certainly recommend that you require that by a local rule. Purposes for meetings are generally not required, although some state laws do require you to state a specific purpose for specific topics. Like a budget hearing, you must put in the notice, we're meeting for the purposes of considering this fiscal year's budget. So again, because agendas are not required, you might do that by local rule, so that you are given that heads up as well as the public. These are some best practices for school boards. This is not part of the Open Meetings Act, but these are ways that do strengthen the OMA that you might consider to bring back and talk with about with your colleagues. Requiring agendas to be posted and requiring them to be sent to board members however many days in advance. That might be on a Friday in advance of a Monday meeting. So you, the board members, have time to read packets of information prior to when you'll be asked to make decisions regarding that information. You might also make your advisory boards and school board committees subject to the Open Meetings Act. I personally highly recommend this for a sex ed advisory board or any kind of curricular group, because eventually it is the school board that has to adopt that in a public meeting. And at that public meeting, you might get folks that attend, and this is the first time that they have been heard on this topic. And now they're asking you to make some amendments, make some changes prior to adoption. So I would certainly talk with your board about whether that makes sense or how else you might encourage public input when building public policy. Include a purpose for your meetings. If you do that, you'll never run afoul of that of other state laws that sometimes do require purpose, and it's good for the public to know. For your regular meetings, there's not really too much of a purpose statement because you're doing the board business that's in front of you. But for a special meeting where you're going to be evaluating the superintendent, why not tell the public that in advance? Now they know that that's the purpose of this meeting. And you could also mention that that's going to take place largely in closed session. Why not let folks know in the public? They could attend the public portion of that meeting before you go into closed session. And it's just good public policy to let folks know about what's going on in your district. And then lastly, on this set of recommendations, special meetings really ought to be rare. If you can avoid them, that's a good for your community so that they have an opportunity to weigh in on whatever is in front of the school board. These things do occasionally happen, and they are allowed by law so long as you have that 18-hour requirement. So you can use them, but as a general practice, you might want to talk with your colleagues about limiting them if you tend to be using a lot of these, because that somewhat prevents the public from, being able to read information in advance of meetings. Next slide.
All right.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions for Eric? I do see Amani has a question in the chat about how we can hold people accountable when the rules aren't followed. And correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but I believe we'll be talking about penalties and reporting violations a little later on.
Yep. So I think this is a good reminder. The Open Meetings Act is mandatory for all public bodies, and our standing rules of order or Robert's Rules of Order or anything like that that your board has adopted, those are optional and recommended. Uh, so certainly we'll go over what to do about an OMA violation by your colleagues and what to do by another violation of the rules of order that you're supposed to use. If you are using Robert's Rules of Order, it's called a point of order. And you might say point of order and ask the presiding officer to enforce a certain rule, right? You could say if you've got a 3-minute time limit for public comment and someone is now going into their 5th minute, you might say point of order, Madam President, you need to stop this person from giving additional public comment. Their time's expired. And that would be a way to kind of call out your colleagues in the most professional sort of way. You could use a point of order. I did
Thank
mention
you.
yep, I see another question in the chat here about a portion of the superintendent evaluation is public. This a superintendent evaluation can only be done in closed session if a superintendent requests it to be in closed session. They typically will, and so that will most often be done during a closed session, but no public body can schedule an entirely closed session meeting. You must schedule an open meeting. We're going to meet on January 30th at 7 p.m. Call the meeting to order, do your regular pieces of how you start meetings, and then and have public comment. All portions of the OMA are required, and then you could move to closed session for the purpose of doing a superintendent's evaluation.
We will have more opportunities for Q&A. If anything comes up, please feel free to drop those questions in the chats.
Okay, so who is a quorum of school board members? This is, by definition, the minimum number of members needed to do business. The Open Meetings Act says that this is a majority of those elected or appointed and serving. So if you're on a standard 7-member school board, 4 members are required to be a quorum to have a meeting. If there's only 3 of you at the meeting, you need to wait until another arrives to officially begin that meeting. And a majority vote is required for all actions before a school board. So if there are 4 members present on a 7-member board, you can conduct business, but every single vote must be a 4-0 vote. If it's a 3-1 vote, that motion fails. The OMA is clear that action by public bodies must be a vote by a majority of those elected or appointed and serving. If you have a member resign and you're at 6 members, 3 out of 6 is not a quorum. 4 out of 6 is a quorum, and 4 members are required for any action, including appointment of a new member to that school board vacancy. Can you discuss board topics with a member outside of a meeting? Canvassing votes is allowed. So if you want to individually call your colleagues, you may. If you want something passed next meeting, you may call every individual board member and tell them your reasons for supporting a proposal, except you cannot do that in a way that's designed to evade the Open Meetings Act. And so what that means is you cannot create a quorum while talking with folks. You cannot say to your colleague Sam, "Hey Sam, I want you to vote yes on this. Susan and Melissa are already a yes. Now you've got Susan, Melissa, yourself, and Sam. That's 4 out of 7. That creates a quorum. You may not do that. What you may do is call them individually. You just can't loop in what you know about other folks and how they intend to vote. You can call folks and say, I hope you'll vote yes on this, or I'm intending to amend something and wanted to give you a heads up so you could think about it. What happens with email communications? Similar thing. You need to be aware of the OMA. It does apply to email communications. And the best way to do this is keep email communications to your colleagues at a minimum. If you're the board chair and sending out agendas, or if you want to alert your colleagues to something that you're going to add last minute, you may do that. I do highly recommend using BCC on an email and putting a disclaimer in your email that says, make sure not to respond to everybody because, again, it's like that phone call. You can have a back and forth with one colleague at a time, but what you can't do is have a big old email chain where Susan is saying, oh, that looks great, I will vote for it. And Sam is saying, yep, this looks great, I'll vote for it. Even if everyone doesn't respond, if you've got email chains that have all members, you have violated the Open Meetings Act. You shouldn't have chains of email among members of a public body, but you can send it to them and BCC people so that they don't have that ability to reply all.
Eric, I did want to let you know that we have a hand up. Lakia, did you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, quick question. Let's say, for instance, if you learn something, if a student emailed you and you wanted to inform the rest of the board of their concerns, can you do that or not?
Yes, you may forward that sort of email to your colleagues. You'll just want to make sure to not give that option for them to reply all, right? So you can send them that as information only, and you might do that if it's going to be discussed at the next meeting. But you just want to avoid giving the opportunity to hit reply all, and now you got a big old email chain where you're discussing things, making decisions about an action item. You shouldn't be making any decisions about action items by email. But yes, you may forward that type of informational item, a one-way communication, to the rest of your school board. Good question.
And Maria has a question in the chat that if it applies to text messages, just like it does to emails.
The OMA absolutely does. And other written communication. Yes. So don't have a text group at all with a quorum of your school board. That certainly violates the OMA. Even if it's outside of a meeting, you should just avoid that. I'd say you just avoid it altogether. Text people as individuals. That works, but not as a group. All right, let's go to the next slide. So there's another question here in the chat about, can you email a clarifying question for regarding something that happened during a past board meeting? Again, this may be something for your council to advise you on, but generally speaking, emails should be quite informational and read mostly as a one-way communication, right? So when a board chair is sending the agenda out to all members, if they do that, then it's the same kind of thing. If you're asking a clarifying question about something that happened at a past board meeting, you don't want to make your colleagues think or give the public the assumption that you're trying to figure out how to redress that online. The best place for that might be at the next board meeting, to ask, hey, was this right in the way that we did it? Or to simply email the presiding officer that question. That might be your best bet, because you don't want to invite discussion of a quorum in an email. We will be providing the some video as well as the link later on. Okay, so when does a quorum not violate the Open Meetings Act? The only exception to the quorum rule is sometimes called the education exception. It is, quote, a meeting which is a social or chance gathering or conference not designed to avoid this act. So, for example, this fits within that education exception. If 4 of 7 of you are here at this training today, it's okay. You don't have to ask someone to leave to get under that quorum. You have not violated the Open Meetings Act. If a quorum ends up in the same class at a conference, though, and this is why this rule was built. It's built so you might go to a school board training conference and you haven't run by all the coursework that you're intending to do with your whole school board. And now a quorum of you end up in the same session. That does not violate the OMA if you do not discuss matters that you might vote on. So if you're at a social or chance gathering or a conference, that's all right. But you should probably not sit together, and you definitely should not discuss as a quorum items that may feasibly be anything to do with your district, anything that your school board might vote on later. Best practice is to not sit with each other in a class where there's participation and discussion about public policy. Social gatherings include like a graduation ceremony. So I'm sure a lot of us have participated in those as you're in your role as a school board member. But again, backstage, while you're waiting for that to start, you should absolutely refrain from discussing public policy and any governance items that belong to the board. This does not mean you can meet in a session locked to the public to discuss strategic planning. This is the second portion here. The excuse, we didn't have anything to vote on, is not a valid excuse to meet as a quorum. That is still a violation of the Open Meetings Act. So you might schedule an entire meeting where you're just going to be talking about strategic planning or building a mission statement for the district. But we're not planning on voting on that today. Does that have to follow the OMA? It absolutely does. You still must, even if you're not planning on taking any votes, you still must follow the OMA for those. Okay, so board member voting, as we mentioned.
Quick question. This is Lakia. Quick question.
Sure.
So, as it relates to like school board retreats, that will be considered open, even if it's like somewhere like off grounds of your regular meeting, but you just listed where it's going to be at.
That's correct. So at a school board retreat, you still need to offer time for public comment. There might be none. A lot of times there's none at a school board retreat. But yes, you still must post it in advance with that date, time, and location, and must offer public comment as required by the Open Meetings Act. The OMA does not limit your retreats to your exact school district, but you might consider that, or make sure that you're not planning a meeting for Traverse City if you're part of the Lansing School Board, because the law does say it needs to be in a place generally accessible to the public. And it's probably referring to your own public that you serve. So doing it at the ISD building, even if it's outside of your district, that may be allowed. But beyond that, you shouldn't go really, really far away from your own community to have any kind of public meeting. So, like we mentioned before, with board member voting, all votes taken by public bodies in Michigan are valid if approved by a majority of those elected or appointed and serving. As a reminder, the common denominator is never the number of people present. It is always that total number of seats on your school board. If you're a 7-member board, every motion must have 4 yes votes to pass it. If there's 5 people at that meeting, it's not 3-2. A 3-2 fails on a 7-member board. A 4-1 approves something on a 7-member board. Other things, you have to vote in person. The only exception is military service. Your minutes must make clear how each member voted. A lot of times this gets missed, or sometimes this gets missed. It doesn't have to list all names. If it's a 7-0 vote, it can simply say 7-0. As long as it's clear that someone looking at these minutes could determine which members voted which direction. If it's a 6-1, you need to make a note that states who was the one. Some districts might have all 7 board member names listed and put checks next to them. Whatever works. The OMA requires that minutes make clear how each member voted. And that's a good thing for democracy, so that they might see how you are different than your colleagues, and they might choose to elect more folks that are like that 1, or more folks that are like that 6. Canvassing votes, like we said, that's calling around, is allowed as long as it's done in a discussion not designed to violate the OMA. So you can chat with folks one-on-one, but not mentioning how other members are planning to vote if you know that. And during meetings, there's no email, text, or communication period with other members. Those are considered discussion, and discussion must happen visible to the public in those open meetings. So you should not be texting your colleagues during school board meetings. That can be part of discussion, and that could be a violation of the Open Meetings Act. Next slide. Okay, closed session. As a general rule, no votes take place in closed session at all. Closed sessions must be entered during a public meeting. So that means you start a public meeting, and sometime during that public meeting, you take a roll call vote to enter into closed session. It has to be a roll call vote. This is one of the few places where those things are required by state law. And you must identify in the minutes one of the following allowed reasons for entering into closed session. These first 3 are a majority vote, and we can go to that slide, and then some are a 2/3 supermajority. So some uses of closed session require simple majority. This list is here. You'll see as part of A, this could be where the superintendent evaluation falls. It's a personnel evaluation of a public officer, only if that superintendent requests a closed hearing. Every superintendent I have heard of does that. But again, in that closed session, you're not making any final decisions, and you have to leave the closed session before you formally adopt the superintendent's evaluation numbers and that formal superintendent evaluation. Also worth mentioning here is the general, how do we do closed session? A vote is required to enter a closed session, and the main meeting's minutes must reflect which one of these purposes you've used to enter that closed session. The conversation must be limited to that scope alone and nothing else. The closed session has its own set of minutes taken. And again, do not take votes in closed session. Some boards do perhaps vote to leave the closed session. It's not required. Your council might feel quite strongly. No one's going to get in big trouble for voting to leave, but you don't have to. It can just be once you're done doing the superintendent's evaluation, the presiding officer says, all right, is that all we have for this? Okay, and gavel back in the open session. The minutes for closed session, because they are required separately, should probably be physically passed out at your next regular meeting, where your group will vote to approve the meeting minutes of both your regular meeting as well as the closed session that took place within it. Closed session minutes are kept for a year and a day. After that, they're destroyed, but you always have a duty to keep that to yourself. The discussions that happen in a closed session may not be disclosed to anybody else that was not there in that closed session. All right, let's go to the next one.
Well,
if we could go to the next slide here. This is also found in that handy dandy OMA handbook, but these are the list of closed sessions that require a supermajority to enter. It's considering the purchase or lease of real property, consulting with your attorney about specific pending litigation, not litigation that might be possible down the road, but only if doing so in an open meeting would affect the settlement position of that public body. And then other things, if a candidate requests that an application remain confidential, that is allowed. So a candidate for your superintendent position may by law request when they send in your documents that they remain confidential. That stays confidential until they're identified as a finalist and asked to do an interview. All interviews by public bodies must be held in an open meeting. So, but up to that point, someone could, and this might be beneficial for a superintendent that's an existing superintendent elsewhere, and they apply for your district. If they don't make it into a finalist and are asked to do an interview, then the fact that they applied can remain completely confidential under state law if they request that. Next slide. And these are the last ones that require a supermajority. Again, this list is in the OMA handbook. And because your minutes require one of these, when you go into closed session, I would highly recommend that on your agenda, it notes which one of these subsections of the OMA you're going to use, because you're required to have that in the minutes. And this last one here is fairly new or newer, to consider security planning to address existing threats or prevent potential threats. So if you're building a shooter response plan, you could do that in a closed session for somewhat obvious reasons. We don't want the public to have access to everything like that when it comes to student safety. That's an allowed reason to use a closed session. Again, with this 2/3 majority, that's out of all members elected or appointed and serving as well. So on a 7-member board, that's 5 of you. If there are only 4 members present, then you can't meet that 2/3 majority requirement. And so you can't go into closed session for one of these reasons. You might put it off to a next meeting when more people are available. Next slide. Okay, so what's in there? What's required? Public participation. The public has a right to attend. The OMA prohibits public bodies from requiring any information be provided in advance or any other condition to attend an open meeting. People cannot be barred from an open meeting except for a breach of the peace at that given meeting. So your presiding officer is allowed to expel people for a breach of the peace. But they can come to the next meeting, and if they haven't been expelled from that particular meeting, they always have a right to attend. There are no lifetime bans. And you can't have any conditions to attend a meeting. So you shouldn't have it where a parking place requires a fee to park there. You also shouldn't have it behind a locked door ever. Someone's not going to be able to get in the building. The public also has the right to record. Anyone may tape record, videotape, broadcast any of your proceedings of a public body. You can set reasonable limits on that, like where they're allowed to be. So they don't have the right to sit next to you at the board table or point their camera at the meeting agenda that's in front of you. But you could require them to have a certain place in the room to record. And then what about this right to speak? Boards may require a name and address to speak, but not to attend. The courts have said that the right to speak is a higher right than the simple right to attend a meeting. So you may require a name and address to speak. That's going to be by local rule. And you may also set time limits on individuals, like you have 3 minutes and everyone that wants to address the board has 3 minutes. Boards may not prevent someone from addressing them. And that includes, you cannot put a 30-minute cap on the public comment period. Next session or next slide. So for public comment, does it have to be on the agenda items or on something else? Your board might limit one period of public comment to agenda items only, but by law, you must have a public comment period without a content restriction. So folks have to be able to say anything else to you. And so if you do limit, we're one back. One slide back. If you do put a limit to agenda items only, you must have another public comment period without that restriction. Your board president can encourage groups to identify spokespersons. This is helpful if there are 30 people that want to talk to you. The board president can also uniformly shorten or extend speaking time. But that first part, identifying spokespersons, that's a request. And if every individual wants to assert their individual right to speak to you, then they must be able to do that. But your presiding officer may say, if a group of you have come and you'd like to identify 3 of you to give your main points to us, that would be appreciated. Time limits are allowed, but overall time limits, like we'll take 30 minutes of comments only, are prohibited explicitly by law. Next slide. Okay, this is penalties. This is the fun part, I think. None of you will run into this because you're attending this training. But to make you aware, a public official who intentionally violates the OMA is guilty of a misdemeanor. Public officials can be personally liable for up to $500 as a penalty per meeting. So do take the OMA seriously. You don't want a misdemeanor trying to just do your duties here. I must tell you that OMA enforcement is incredibly rare. These lawsuits have no damages, nor are attorney's fees guaranteed, even if you win, which is what causes lawsuits about the OMA to be rare. But still, you don't want to be the one that is on the losing side of this. Public officials can be personally liable here, meaning there's not governmental immunity for intentional violations of the OMA. But if you make a mistake, a lot of times judges in these cases will order a fix, but they won't give you a misdemeanor on the first violation if you have some evidence that it wasn't intentional. We just didn't know this part of the law. Next slide. So how can you report an OMA violation? You may personally sue a public body in a state court. That's the more expensive route. Or because there is this misdemeanor provision, you can file a police report. Private actors may file lawsuits to seek compliance or file a police report, which are reviewed by the county prosecutor, who may then counsel the public body about how to fix the issue, or if the public body refuses, that prosecutor may then bring civil or criminal charges against that public body. Sometimes police departments are unaware that they play any role in OMA enforcement. So it's worth discussing that with the police jurisdictions in your area, in your city or your county sheriff's department, because they do have a legal duty. And this I got directly from the Michigan Department of Attorney General. So that might be something you run into. Hopefully, folks are not violating the OMA all the time, but that is the free version. You may file a police report to have the authorities look into this. And next one. Okay, here are some other best practices from this second portion that we've gone over. I highly recommend that you record and post your meetings, that you host all meetings in district. Now, if it's at an ISD building, the law permits it, but it does say accessible to the general public. And that probably means your public, right? So why have a meeting 2 districts away when there's a suitable option, a suitable location for a board retreat that's in your district and closer to the public you serve? I also recommend eliminating the public comment requirement that a physical address be given. Some folks are uncomfortable with this. A lot of boards aren't too keen on really enforcing that rule anyway. But you could ask folks when they give public comment as an alternative, and would you tell us, are you a district resident or are you a guest? That's a way for folks to tell you if they live there or not, or what their relationship is to the district without having to say, I live at 123 Park Street. If you're recording those meetings, it could just be a safety thing and a preference for folks to not want to share that. And take an OMA handbook to your meetings. It's super helpful if you get into any sort of sticky situation to do that. All right, next slide. Okay, we're at another Q&A session. What do we have?
So we don't have much time. So I didn't see any other questions that came up in the chat. So I'm hoping that we can maybe move on to the next section and cover additional Q&A at the end. Does that sound good, Eric?
Sure.
All right.
Okay,
If you at home have any questions, just please feel free to put them in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. So as a refresher, that's pretty much all you need to know about the Open Meetings Act. Plus, reading through that handbook is a great tool. But again, the OMA is required. It requires public comment be given, that notice be given, that there not be any restraints on who can attend the meeting physically, and that it takes place somewhere generally available to the public. So you shouldn't have any fees to get into the building to get into a public meeting. That would certainly violate the Open Meetings Act. Now we're going to switch gears in the third act of this presentation to Robert's Rules of Order. As a reminder, Robert's Rules of Order are optional. Your board may adopt them. Many school boards in Michigan and other public bodies formally adopt Robert's Rules of Order as part of their policies and bylaws. So if you've done that, this is explicitly for you. And if you don't have any standing rules, we'll go over some of the main parts of Robert's Rules that are most helpful, and you might explicitly put those ones into a policy about which ones you intend to use. Next slide. Okay, who the heck is Robert? For this, we might just scrap the small groups. Do we have the time?
Why don't we take about 5 minutes for the small groups so that we can, connect with some of the other school board members we might not usually be able to connect with. So, Trina, can you open up those breakout rooms?
Okay, did we get everybody back?
It's going to take a little 5 more seconds.
Okay. So hopefully you got to meet some other school board members just trying their best to learn something about this. And now we'll go. Would anyone like to share something that they know about Robert's Rules or a question you might have up front? Otherwise, you can ask them while we go through this.
I just wanted to make sure that Renee sees that Charlie put the OMA handbook in a link to the OMA handbook in the chat. That's one resource.
Yep, thanks. And we'll also send that out after the session. So if you're following along again, you can click these hyperlinks in here. We've prepared a one-pager on Robert's Rules of Order. And there's also a Robert's Rules cheat sheet guide to motions that is super helpful for you to take a look at, which is now on the screen. Well, it's part of this presentation. So in the short time we have, the main takeaway for the entire set of rules is to protect the rights of the minority opinion. In any meeting, this is an essential tool that is built to protect the rights of the minority, because that may be the majority. Either you can convince your colleagues of that, or the public might one day elect different colleagues that makes that opinion now the majority opinion. So Robert's Rules is an essential tool, or one tool that can be used to protect the rights of minority opinions. So let's go on to some things included in it. Consent agendas, most of us are familiar and use these at every meeting. This comes from Robert's Rules of Order. And by definition, these are routine and uncontroversial topics that are grouped together for a single vote. So it's going to be monthly reports. On the right here, there's it might be the last meeting minutes, any correspondence you received, maybe retirements and hiring updates if you've assigned that role to the superintendent as opposed to yourselves. And any member has the right to remove any item from the consent agenda. So if you want to talk about last minute's meetings, you can say, would you hit the next slide button again? Yep. Here's our consent agenda example. If you want to consider the last meeting minutes separately because you might want to change them, then you have a right to tell the presiding officer, I'm removing B from the consent agenda. It's not a request, it is a right. And that's because the consent agenda, by definition, are uncontroversial topics. So if you want to make some change, you pull it out, vote on the rest of the consent agenda, and then you can make a motion, discussion, and vote on the part you pulled out. Next slide. Okay, so the main way that things work in Robert's Rules of Order, which you might not use entirely in this order, but it's helpful to know, is a motion, a second, discussion, and then a vote. That's the general rule for everything. And you want to remind your presiding officer to ask for discussion on every topic. They should just get in the habit of it. A lot of times it'll be motion, second, let's take a vote. You need to remind people, nope, you need to ask for discussion. That's a right of all members. So when you make a motion, that's called a main motion. During this discussion period is where you can make secondary or subsidiary motions. And those are going to be, they have to be on topic, but they can be anything about the topic you're discussing in that main motion. I move to adopt Resolution A. Is there a second? Second. Now we get to discussion, and one of you could say, I move to change line 1 of Resolution A to read reject rather than adopt. You know, you could do that. It's called a secondary or subsidiary motion. And again, the same thing. It's a motion within a motion. That one needs a second as well. You need to discuss it, and then you need to vote on whether to make that change. And then you can vote or further discuss and vote on the overall document, the final document. It's okay to mess up Robert's rules sometimes, okay? Just some key principles. Clarity is key. So you should handle one item at a time and fully finish that before you go on to some other item in a meeting. Slow down meetings to ensure that the entire group is able to ask questions, and especially that folks are able to understand their vote. One thing that Robert's Rules of Order puts in there as a really good recommendation is that presiding officers should restate the motion prior to calling for a vote, especially if the document you're looking at has had some changes, right? If you've adopted some secondary motions, the presiding officer should restate the motion. Is the motion for approval, where a yes would vote to approve, or is the motion for rejection, where a yes would be rejecting it? Have your presiding officer restate it if there's any question, just so everyone's on the same page about what they're voting for. Next slide. Okay, member speakers' rights. Members are encouraged to speak once and then not again until all members have had the opportunity to speak. but generally there's not a limit on how many times you can speak. A 2/3 vote is needed to end debate, or it's sometimes called calling the question. And a general Robert's Rules of Order rule is that a supermajority is needed to curtail any speaking rights of other members. It's about protecting the minority opinion rights. Okay, next slide. This is the one that you might use the most often, a point of order. Presiding officers are responsible for enforcing rules at the meeting, and any member can ask for that rule, for any rule to be enforced. You might do that just by getting their attention or by saying, point of order, Madam President, would you stop this person who's gone beyond their 3-minute time for public comment? If things get really unruly, Robert's Rules of Order recommends that members only address the chair of a meeting. Most meetings don't really require this. There's 7 of you, but if things get really unruly and personal insults are being thrown, someone could say point of order and ask that all comments be made to the president of the board. Mr. President, I disagree with my colleague because of this. That is a lot more cordial than then you suck and I hope you lose this vote, right? Point of information is to ask a question, or you could just raise it, that is not necessary, but it's something that you might adopt. And then a point of personal privilege is something that's needed to help you be fully present in the meeting. Could you close the window or turn down the AC so I can hear what we're talking about? That would be personal privilege. Next slide. This is just, we're going to send you this in advance. The ones that are bolded are more often used by school board members, but a lot of things under Robert's Rules of Order require supermajorities to end debate, and we can go to the next one as well. And yep, you can also suspend the rules to if that's helpful in your meeting. Okay. Another general rule is that boards are always have more authority than the presiding officer. So what do you do if the presiding officer is wrong? Hit the next slide button, or twice, I think. Overrule them. Hit it one more time. So this is a point of order. Public comment times can't be given to other people. Maybe the presiding officer says, oh, 3 people signed up in advance, but they all want to give now a total of 9 minutes, if you have a 3-minute rule, to this one person. If the chair says, I say that they can, you, as any member, can object to that decision, and then it should be asked in a way where yes means agreeing with the chair's decision, or no means overruling the chair. And that's just a majority vote. You may overrule any ruling of a board president anytime. And this method is just laid out in Robert's Rules, but that you can do at any time. Okay. Next slide. We're at the very end of this, folks, so we're almost wrapping up here. Here's some other best practices. You should adopt some kind of formal rules for your meetings. Like I said, I don't think Robert's Rules as an entire package is extremely helpful because it's a 500-page book. But you might adopt certain parts of it, or create a document that here's the general rules that we use, that we reference, so that they can't be misinterpreted, misused by certain members of your school board. Take speakers' rights seriously. Make sure you're protecting the rights of the minority, whether or not you have Robert's Rules of Order. That is essential for us to build collaborative spaces, and because the community might support that minority view. And discuss the limited role of a presiding officer. They are an agenda prepper, and not an independent decision maker. You are allowed to overrule them if need be in meetings. But you should talk about that when you're deciding who's going to be the president. You're prepping agendas. You might be meeting with the superintendent to do that, but they can't make independent decisions for the board. Presidents may occasionally give comments to the news media or folks that reach out on behalf of the board, but that should really be based on decisions that were already made by a majority vote of your school board. And that's what
I'm sorry to interject here. I am working on correcting the link here for the evaluation. So as I get that corrected, can we move to a little Q&A, because we do have some questions in the chat. One of those questions comes from Sharon, and she's wondering if it is if you're not a board member and you want to reach out to your board via email, is it best to email them individually or use like the broad Board of Education email address?
You can definitely use the all email button all at once. It's really up to the school board to make sure that they're not hitting reply all. So a lot of them are already set up to just go individually to members, and they might be able to respond to you and say, thanks for your comments. But it's on the school board to make sure that that happens. So yes, you can email everybody. Other questions in the comments? If there's So if there are a lot of people that go to a meeting and have not informed anyone and they don't fit in the space, this is probably a good question for council. I've seen long lines at public meetings, so it's not, I don't think that it's required to move. You should ask your legal team about that. But if at all possible, even if they haven't given you notice, going to the auditorium is going to be recommended in that situation, just so everyone doesn't have to stand out in the cold. Okay, it looks like we got the eval link working. It's in the chat. So, or maybe not. Maybe not. We will send this out if we don't get it now. Try the latest link now.
Yes. All right, let's see. No. All right. In the meantime, there was a follow-up question to Sharon's question. If you could answer this question, when a member of the public emails the entire board, can the board reply all? So all board members are aware of the response.
If you do that at all, it should be the presiding officer. I would probably run it past your legal counsel because that one is tricky. You don't want to speak on behalf of the school board unless it's about a decision that's already been made. So certainly if they asked a narrow factual question, you could probably respond and BCC the rest of your colleagues to make sure that they know that this has been addressed and that question's been answered. Check with your counsel to make sure that you avoid what could be construed as discussing things by email.
All right, and let me know if that evaluation link is working for y'all. I will try to get that going. I do apologize. Are there any other questions we have for Eric as we wrap this up?
I see one here from my friend in Plymouth Canton. What if someone keeps saying the same thing over and over and prolonging the discussion time? So that general rule about a supermajority to curtail speakers' rights, reminder that's in Robert's Rules and it is optional. If you have adopted Robert's Rules of Order, you probably should vote as a supermajority to end debate and then vote on the main question that's being presented. But you could also have a different policy that says every board member gets 5 minutes. That's another thing in the chat. Matt Schreiner puts in here, as a board, we have a 5-minute limit on each member discussion per item. That is definitely allowed because it's not part of the OMA that they have to have unlimited speakers' rights, right? You could create a local rule as long as it's applied fairly. You can create local rules on how long your members can speak. And does the OMA apply to nonprofit organizations? It does not. You might adopt portions of it that work for you, but you certainly don't have to provide notice to the public that you're meeting. There's no requirement for public comment at nonprofit boards.
So I apologize. I want to just respect folks' time and say thank you. So for folks that do have additional questions, Eric John, would you be able to stay for like another 5 minutes or so?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you all for joining.
And so I'll just add that, you know, we know that our schools are going through some pretty complicated times right now, right? So even though we haven't talked about the hard realities, and I imagine the hard conversations y'all are having, right? Just please know that we are working on sample school board resolutions and a lot of other things. So if that is something that you think you need, or you need something and you're not really sure if there's someone else that's already got it, right? Please reach out to Charlie or I, and we'd be happy to connect. Sorry to cut you off, Eric John.
That's all right. All right. So we're wrapping up. I want to say thanks again for taking this time. When I was a school board member, I met with every new school board member that was elected during my tenure. Regardless of our politics, I hope that this has helped you be able to think about how to work more collaboratively with everyone on your board, because for the time being, those are the champions for your students, just like you are. So certainly reach out a hand, protect minority opinions in your board discussions, and do more trainings. Thanks for coming, and I really appreciate your willingness to both be a school board member and be an educated school board member to try to learn something about this to better advocate for your students.